rain had just stopped when Alexander Grant stepped into his study, the kind of room that carried both the weight of wealth and the loneliness of its owner. The walls were lined with shelves of first editions, the scent of leather and old paper heavy in the air. A fire smoldered in the grand stone fireplace, its light catching the polished edges of mahogany furniture. On one side of the room stood a safe, massive, gleaming steel, the kind that whispered of fortunes tucked inside. Tonight, it stood open, stacks of crisp bills resting in careless piles, as though money meant nothing to the man who owned it. But to Alexander, money had become a weapon. At 48, with an empire built from steel and sweat and ruthless calculation, he should have been a man at peace. Instead, betrayal had carved something cold into him. A partner he trusted like a brother had embezzled $3 million from him. $3 million, siphoned quietly, cleverly, until the truth ripped through his world like glass shattering against stone. That was the night Alexander stopped believing in honesty. That was the night he became convinced everyone had a price, that given the chance, even the kindest soul would take what wasn't theirs. Now he sat in the wide leather chair by the window, pretending to drift towards sleep. His eyes, half closed, tracked the reflection of the open safe in the glass. This wasn't just another night in the mansion. This was a test, his test. Down the long hall, the sound of soft footsteps echoed against marble. Maya Jefferson arrived like she always did, quiet, graceful, almost invisible. At 29, her beauty wasn't in diamonds or silk gowns, but in the quiet dignity she carried on her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her uniform plain, her hands always busy with work that never seemed to end. And yet, even in her tiredness, there was a strength and GTH in the way she moved. Alexander had seen it before, the way she guided her daughter with a patience that seemed unshakable. Lila, her 6-year-old shadow, trailed behind with wide, curious eyes that took in everything. The little girl clutched a worn notebook where she scribbled numbers and drawings whenever her mother worked late. She was small for her age, but her spirit was larger than the mansion itself. Alexander had noticed that too. They entered the study, Maya with her dusting cloth, Lila with her questions. To them, this was just another room. To Alexander, it was the stage of his cruel experiment. He forced his breath into a slow, steady rhythm, feigning the calm of sleep while his mind raced with suspicion. Would the maid he paid, who surely longed for a better life, resist the temptation? Would her child, too innocent to understand the weight of money, touch the bills that lay scattered like leaves in autumn? He waited, poised on the edge of disappointment, bracing himself for the moment when his beliefs about people, that they were all driven by greed, would once again be proven true. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. Maya began her work, wiping down the bookshelves with careful precision. She hummed softly under her breath, a tune Alexander didn't recognize, one that sounded both tired and tender, like a lullaby sung through years of sacrifice. Lila, restless, wandered closer to the safe. Her small footsteps tapped against the floor, each one tightening the grip in Alexander's chest. And then it happened. The little girl paused before the open safe. She tilted her head, eyes widening as she stared at the mountain of bills stacked before her. Alexander felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Here it was, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment his cynicism demanded. His breathing stilled. He braced himself for the inevitable. Would this child, who had probably never held more than a few dollars, reach out with tiny fingers and prove him right? Or would something else happen, something he couldn't yet imagine? As the firelight flickered across her face, Alexander Grant, billionaire and broken man, lay perfectly still, watching through the smallest crack of his eyelids, waiting for a truth that could change everything. Lila's eyes sparkled in the glow of the fire, wide and unblinking as she stared at the open safe. The bills weren't just paper to her, they were magic, more money than she could ever imagine in her small world. She stood frozen for a moment, her little chest rising and falling quickly, as though the sight itself was too big for her to take in. Alexander, behind his mask of sleep, felt his stomach twist. He had seen men with decades of wealth break under temptation far smaller than this. What chance did a child have? But then Lila did something that made the air in the room shift. Instead of reaching out to take, she stepped closer with a kind of carefulness that looked almost reverent. She crouched down, her tiny fingers hovering just above the stacks. Alexander nearly opened his eyes, ready to catch her in the act, ready to confirm what he already believed. Yet she didn't snatch. She didn't steal. With a furrow in her brow, Lila picked up one pile of bills and frowned. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "They're all messy." She bit her lip the way children do when they're focused, and then, with deliberate patience, she began to straighten the notes. One by one, She aligned the edges, separating them by size, stacking them neatly into clean little towers. Her tiny hands worked with a kind of innocence that made the scene look almost holy, as if she wasn't touching money at all, but something sacred. Alexander felt his throat tighten. He had expected greed, but what he saw was order, care, and honesty. The little girl wasn't thinking of what she could take, she was thinking of Dow to make it right. Maya turned suddenly, realizing her daughter had gone quiet. She gasped when she saw her. "Lila," she hissed, rushing over and pulling the girl's hands away. Fear streaked across her face, not for the money, but for the consequences. "You can't touch the boss's things. Do you understand? Never, ever touch." Her voice cracked with worry, as though this one innocent act could cost them everything. "But Mommy," Lila protested softly, her small voice trembling. "It was messy. I just wanted to make it neat, like how you taught me with our coins at home. You said money should always be tidy." Her eyes blinked up at her mother, wide and full of that painful honesty only a child could carry. Maya's lips pressed together, her heart racing. She crouched down to meet her daughter's gaze. "I know, baby. I know you meant no harm, but this isn't ours. We keep our hands to our own things, do you understand? Even if it looks messy, even if no one is watching, we leave it." Alexander, still in his chair, felt the words burn into him like a brand. Even if no one is watching. The same lesson his mother had once tried to teach him when he was young. Lessons he had long since buried under layers of cynicism and betrayal. Lila lowered her head, ashamed. "I'm sorry, Mommy." Maya pulled her close, kissing her forehead, whispering, "You did nothing wrong. You only wanted to help. But some things don't belong to us, no matter how close they are." The moment should have ended there, simple, forgettable. But for Alexander, it carved something deep inside him. He had staged this scene to expose dishonesty, certain he would find it. Instead, he found a child whose instinct wasn't to take, but to care. He found a mother whose first lesson to her daughter wasn't survival, but integrity. Now, watching a maid and her daughter live by them so naturally, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against the walls of his cynicism. Shame, admiration, longing. That night, alone in his study, Alexander poured himself a glass of bourbon and stared at the fire. The safe was locked now, its heavy door sealed tight, but his mind kept replaying the image of Lila's small hands carefully aligning those bills. He took a sip, but the liquor burned differently. It didn't dull the ache in his chest. For the first time in years, Alexander Grant wondered if his empire, his fortune, his walls of steel and glass had all been built on the wrong foundation. And though he did not yet know it, his quiet observation of Maya and Lila was the beginning of a transformation that neither wealth nor power could have ever bought. The days that followed carried a strange weight for Alexander. He was a man used to controlling outcomes, signing papers that bent the future to his will, making calls that changed the course of entire industries. Yet here, in his own home, he found himself powerless, watching a maid and her daughter through quiet moments that felt more honest than anything he had known in years. He told himself it was research, a curiosity to see if the lesson of that open safe had been a fluke. But deep down, he knew it was more. Something in him wanted to believe again, and that want terrified him. At night, when the mansion grew silent, Alexander would stand by the study window with the lights dimmed and think about the way Maya guided her child. He remembered the way she bent low, her voice gentle but firm, teaching Lila about honesty, patience, respect. They were lessons he hadn't heard in decades, lessons he once thought belonged to fairy tales and forgotten villages. But here was a woman who had nothing, no wealth, no safety net, no partner to lean on, and yet she raised our daughter, as if character itself was a treasure worth more than gold. It unsettled him, but it also drew him in. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back board meetings, Alexander returned home later than usual. The mansion glowed with soft lamplight, and he paused at the entrance of the grand hall. Maya was finishing her work, dusting the edge of a framed painting, while Lila sat nearby with her little notebook balanced on her knees. Alexander leaned silently against the doorway, his tall frame hidden by shadows. "Mommy?" Lila said suddenly, looking up from her scribbles. "Why does Mr. Grant always look so sad?" The question hit Alexander like a blade slipped between his ribs. Maya lowered the cloth, surprised by her daughter's words. "What makes you think he's sad?" she asked. "Because," Lila said, her small voice firm, "he has a big house but he eats dinner alone. He has so many rooms but no one laughs in them. When I look at him, his eyes feel like rain." Maya was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Sweetheart, Sometimes people can have everything in the world and still feel empty inside. That's why we must always be thankful for each other. Love is what fills a home, not money. Alexander stepped back, breath catching in his chest. No business rival, no shareholder, no journalist had ever managed to pierce him the way a 6-year-old just had. His eyes feel like rain. The words wouldn't leave him. The very next day, Alexander sat in the boardroom of his empire, marble floors and glass walls surrounding him, but he couldn't shake the echo of Lila's voice. And it was there, in that sterile room, that the shadow of another figure stepped into his life again, Richard Blackwell. The fire crackled louder, filling the silence that followed. Alexander fought to keep his eyes closed, though everything in him wanted to sit up, to demand answers, to ask why this girl, this child, was the first person in years to prove him wrong. Instead, he stayed still, swallowing the emotion that rose unexpectedly in his chest. His world, built on suspicion, had just cracked, and he knew, without understanding why, that what he had just witnessed was going to change everything. The following morning, the mansion was quiet except for the echo of Maya's soft footsteps and the faint chatter of Lila's voice drifting down the hall. Alexander lingered in the shadows of the balcony above the grand foyer, hidden, watching them as if they were a puzzle he had not yet figured out. He told himself it was curiosity, a man's need to confirm what he had witnessed the night before. But the truth was deeper. Something in him had been unsettled, cracked open by a child's simple act of honesty. For years, Alexander Grant had seen the world in sharp edges: greed, betrayal, self-interest. He built his empire on the belief that trust was a liability, that kindness was a mask people wore until the price was right. But Lila, this small girl who had looked at $3 million and thought only of tidying it, had thrown that belief into question. And Alexander, a man who had once been certain of everything, found himself doubting. Maya moved with her usual quiet grace, a basket of cleaning supplies in her hands. She hummed again, that same low tune from the night before, like a lullaby carrying traces of sorrow and resilience. Lila sat cross-legged on the polished marble floor nearby, her notebook open, tongue between her teeth as she drew crooked little houses and suns with wide beams of light. "Mommy," Lila said suddenly, her voice echoing against the cavernous walls, "if we had mon. You like Mr. Grant? Would we buy a big house too?" Maya froze. She set down the cloth she was using and crouched beside her daughter. "Sweetheart, we don't worry about what other people have. We worry about what's ours. A small home filled with love is better than a mansion that's empty." Alexander's chest tightened. He had everything money could buy, yet every night he returned to silence, to halls echoing with nothing but his own footsteps. Empty. The word struck like a stone against glass. He followed them quietly throughout the week, never announcing himself, always pretending to be occupied. But in truth, he was watching, listening, learning. At the company headquarters, he noticed something he had overlooked before. Maya arrived after long morning hours at another job, cleaning at a doctor's office across town. He saw her sit with Lila in the waiting area, where the girl quietly did homework or played with her worn-out crayons. There were no complaints, no tantrums, just quiet patience, as though Lila had been born with the understanding that her mother's work was survival. One afternoon, Alexander passed by the break room just as Maya bent down to speak to her daughter. He stopped at the door, unseen, when he heard her words. "We always return what isn't ours, even if no one is watching. Our honesty is worth more than any money in the world." Lila nodded with solemn seriousness, as though the lesson was as important as air itself. Alexander closed his eyes, the words striking chords he hadn't heard in decades. His mother's voice came back to him in flashes, her telling him as a boy to never cheat, to never lie, to never let greed poison him. Somewhere along the way, he had lost those teachings, smothered them beneath boardrooms, betrayals, and numbers on screens. Richard was everything Alexander despised, arrogant, entitled, born into money rather than earning it. At 50, he carried himself with the lazy authority of someone who had never truly worked for anything. He smirked when he spoke, laughed too loudly, and treated those below him as if they were invisible. Alexander tolerated him only because Richard's father had been one of the company's founding partners, his family holding significant shares. But today, Richard's gaze lingered too long on a document showing salary adjustments Alexander himself had quietly ordered. "What's this?" Richard said, tapping the paper with his manicured finger. "Why are we wasting extra money on cleaning staff, especially that one?" His lip curled with disdain. "Diana Jefferson is an excellent professional," Alexander replied coolly, using Maya's formal name, his tone clipped. "Warning." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Excellent? She's a maid, nothing more. Give people like her an extra coin and they'll soon be asking for the whole vault. It's in their nature." Alexander's jaw tightened. though he kept his composure. Inside, a fire roared, hotter than he'd felt in years. He saw again Lila's little hands stacking bills with reverence, her voice whispering about neatness, not greed, and here was Richard, spitting poison without knowing the truth. That night, when Alexander returned home, he didn't retreat to his study as usual. Instead, he lingered near the halls where Maya worked, watching as she guided Lila gently toward bed, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's small shoulder. The mansion felt less cold in their presence, as though their very existence carried warmth. But Alexander knew something Richard didn't. His arrogance and prejudice would not go unchecked. Not this time. He had tested Maya and her daughter. He had seen the truth of their character wits, his own eyes. And now, with Richard circling like a vulture, Alexander felt something awaken in him that had long been dormant, a dangerous, righteous kind of anger. He had been betrayed before, but never like this. This was not about money. This was about dignity. And Alexander Grant, a man who could buy and sell empires with a single call, was about to discover there was one fight worth more than fortune, the fight to protect the innocent. Richard Blackwell was the kind of man who thrived on shadows. He had never built anything with his own hands, never fought for survival the way Alexander once had. But he knew how to sniff out weakness, or at least what he thought was weakness. That week, he set his sights on Maya Jefferson. It began with words tossed like stones, sharp enough to bruise without leaving marks. He cornered her in the hallway late one evening, his voice dripping with false politeness. "You've been here a while, haven't you? Funny, most cleaning staff never last. But then you've been getting special treatment, haven't you?" Maya froze, clutching her basket of supplies. Lila was just a few steps away, coloring on the marble floor with broken crayons. Maya's voice was steady, but her knuckles whitened around the handle. "Sir, I don't know what you mean. I only do my work." Richard leaned closer, his smirk widening. "Don't play coy. I've seen the payroll reports. You're making more than others in your position. What exactly are you doing to earn that, His tone was venomous, his eyes filled with the smug certainty of a man who thought the world was his to control. Lila's head shot up at the sound of his voice. She saw her mother stiffen, saw the way Richard's looming shadow pressed too close. Her small body trembled, but she clutched her notebook tightly as though it could shield her. "Mommy," she whispered, "why is that man being mean?" Maya knelt quickly, shielding her daughter with her body. Her voice was calm, dignified, even as her heart pounded. "Don't worry, my love. Some people carry storms inside them and they try to rain on others. But we stay dry. We stay strong." Richard barked out a cruel laugh, his arrogance filling the hall. "Storms? That's rich. You think your little words mean anything here? You're nothing but a maid, and that child, dragging her around this building like it's some kind of daycare, it's pathetic. You don't belong here. Neither of you." From the shadows of his study doorway, Alexander heard every word. He had been watching, waiting, ever since that boardroom meeting when Richard revealed the ugliness behind his grin. Now the ugliness was spilling out unchecked, aimed at the very people Alexander had begun to care for. His fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't step in. Not yet, not here. Rage boiled in his chest, but it was a calculated kind of rage, the kind that demanded precision. He knew men like Richard, loud, careless, so sure of their invincibility that they never noticed when the ground beneath them started to crack. That night, alone in his room, Alexander sat at his desk, the lights low, his reflection staring back at him from the glass of a half-empty tumbler of bourbon. He replayed the scene again and again, Richard's sneer, Maya's trembling shoulders, Lila's frightened whisper. His heart beat with something he had not felt in years, a fury that wasn't about business or betrayal, but about justice. He pulled out his phone, the decision forming before he could talk himself out of it. "Marcus," he said when the line picked up. The voice on the other end chuckled. "Haven't heard from you in a while, Grant. What kind of trouble this time?" "The kind that needs to be exposed," Alexander replied, his tone steel. "Institutional prejudice, abuse of power. I need everything on Richard Blackwell, every email, every call, every skeleton in his closet. I want him stripped bare." There was a pause, then Marcus's low laugh. "That pompous fool. This'll be easier than stealing candy from a baby. Guys like him always leave a trail." Alexander set the phone down, his jaw tightening as he stared into the fire. This wasn't just about punishing Richard. It was about something far greater. He had tested Maya and her daughter, waiting for them to prove him wrong about humanity. And they had. Now it was his turn to prove something. To them, to himself, and to every sneering man like Richard who thought decency was weakness. In that moment, Alexander Grant made a silent vow. Richard Blackwell's reign of arrogance and cruelty would end, and when it did, it would end in a way so devastating, so public, that the man would never recover. The next days grew heavier, the air around the company thick with tension. Richard Blackwell had always been smug, but now he became relentless. It was as if humiliating Maya had become his private sport. He prowled the halls late at night, waiting for her shifts, always with that sharp smirk curling on his lips. And though Maya never answered him with anything but quiet dignity, Alexander could see the toll it was taking. He noticed the way her shoulders stiffened when Richard appeared, the way her hands shook slightly when she gathered her supplies. One night, the humiliation became unbearable. Maya and Lila had just arrived for the evening shift. Lila carried her little notebook, clutching it against her chest like armor, while her mother set up the cleaning cart. The halls were empty, polished marble gleaming under the soft overhead lights. And then Richard stepped out from around the corner. His voice dripped with false cheer. Well, look who's here again. The night crew, or should I say, the charity case. Maya's back straightened. Good evening, Mr. Blackwell, she said calmly, her voice careful. Richard circled her slowly, like a predator enjoying the chase. Tell me, Maya, he said, emphasizing her name with mocking sweetness. How long do you think this will last? This little arrangement of yours? Extra pay for extra favors? Lila's face twisted in confusion. Mommy, what does he mean? She asked softly. Maya crouched quickly, pulling her daughter close. He doesn't mean anything, sweetheart, just noise, nothing more. But Richard wasn't finished. He leaned down, his voice turning sharp. Noise? No, this is truth. You don't belong here. You're a maid, a cleaner, invisible. That's your place. And dragging your kid around like this? He sneered, pointing at Lila. It's pathetic. This isn't a daycare. Do your job and disappear. That's all you're good for. For a moment, silence filled the hallway. Lila's eyes brimmed with tears, her small hands clutching her mother's sleeve. Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't cry. She didn't break. She simply pulled her daughter into her arms and whispered, We are not invisible. Remember that. From the shadows, unseen, Alexander watched it all. His blood burned. He had been betrayed by partners, lied to by executives, robbed by men who smiled to his face. But this, watching Richard spit venom at a woman who had done nothing but work with grace, frightening a child whose only crime was innocence, this ignited something deeper than rage. It was a fire in his chest, a call to act. That night, in his office, Alexander replayed the security footage. Every word Richard had spat, every insult, every sneer, it was all there, captured by the very system Richard himself had once approved. Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes dark with resolve. He could destroy Richard with this alone, but destruction wasn't enough. He wanted Richard to hang himself with his own arrogance. He wanted the world to see the truth, the board, the employees, the media. He wanted Richard exposed so completely that no amount of family money or privilege could protect him. He called Marcus again. It's worse than I thought, Alexander said. He's not just insulting her, he's threatening her in front of her child. I told you, Marcus replied, his voice low and steady. Guys like him, they think they're untouchable, but it makes them sloppy. You give me a week, I'll have a dossier that'll bury him alive. Alexander's lips pressed into a hard line. Not a week, he said. We don't have a week. He's escalating. Tonight, he tried to crush her in front of her daughter. Tomorrow he'll go further. We move now. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, all right, then let's build a trap. Let him think he's winning, and when he makes his move, we'll have him from every angle. Alexander ended the call and looked toward the empty hallway outside his office. He thought of Maya's quiet strength, of Lila's trembling voice asking why the man was being so mean. His chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years, not just anger, but responsibility. Richard Blackwell had crossed a line, and Alexander Grant, for the first time in a long time, was ready to cross one too. The storm had shifted. Alexander felt it in the air, thick, charged, inevitable. Richard Blackwell had gone too far, and now every insult, every sneer, every drop of poison he spilled was only writing his own downfall. Alexander was done watching. He would act, but he would do it with precision, the way he built his empire, not with brute force, but with strategy so airtight that his enemy wouldn't realize he was already finished until the walls closed in. Marcus arrived at the mansion late that night. The former FBI investigator was sharp-eyed, dressed in a dark jacket, carrying a leather folder under his arm. Alexander poured 2 glasses of bourbon, sliding one across the desk. Marcus didn't touch it. Instead, he opened the folder, spreading photographs and documents across the mahogany surface. Your boy Richard has a trail a mile long, Marcus said flatly. 3 lawsuits, harassment, intimidation, racial slurs, settled quietly with his father's money. 4 transfers to other companies whenever the heat got too close. He's not just careless, Alexander. He's a predator, and he thinks he's untouchable. Alexander studied the photos. Richard at dinners, Richard smirking in boardrooms, Richard shaking hands with men who looked just as entitled. His jaw tightened. Good. That arrogance will be his rope. All I need is the perfect noose. Marcus leaned back. He's sloppy. He talks too much. I've already pulled some of his private messages. Racist garbage. Things he thinks only his little circle sees. If you want him exposed, we can leak this tomorrow and bury him. No, Alexander said coldly, his voice steady as steel. I don't just want him buried. I want him caught in the act. I want him to destroy himself in front of everyone. Marcus raised an eyebrow. So we let him play? Alexander nodded. Exactly. Men like Richard think they're the hunters. But the moment they smell blood, they run straight into the trap. And I already know his next move. He'll try to frame Maya. It's only a matter of time. As if the universe wanted to confirm Alexander's words, the very next day Richard began whispering to the wrong people. In the HR office, Sandra Miller, the director who had worked loyally under Alexander for years, received an unexpected visit. Richard strutted in, a file tucked under his arm. This employee, Richard said, dropping papers on her desk, has been arriving late and bringing a child into a corporate environment? Completely unprofessional. It's grounds for termination. Sandra frowned, flipping through the file. Mr. Blackwell, I've checked Maya's records. She's never once been late in 2 years, and there's no written policy forbidding her child from— Records can be adjusted, Richard cut in sharply, his voice rising. My word should be enough. Sandra's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue further. She had seen this before, men like Richard, using intimidation as proof. She quietly made a note to herself. Something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Alexander, watching from his office feed, caught every word. His anger simmered, but his satisfaction grew. Richard was already stepping into the snare. That evening, Marcus returned with a new piece of intelligence. He's planning something, Marcus said. Intercepted a text chain between him and one of his cronies. He wants to stage a theft, plant something valuable in Maya's cleaning cart, discover it, then call security and the cops, humiliate her, force her out. Alexander's blood went cold. He pictured Lila watching her mother accused, her small hands trembling, her wide eyes filling with fear. The thought was unbearable. But then, slowly, a darker smile spread across his face. Perfect, Alexander said quietly. Let him try. We'll have cameras where he doesn't expect, microphones in the walls, and when he calls the police, they'll be here already. Only not for Maya. Marcus smirked. A sting operation? A reckoning, Alexander replied. The kind he'll never recover from. That night, Alexander walked the quiet halls of his mansion. He passed by Maya, who was gently tucking Lila's scarf around her small shoulders before heading home. He paused, watching them without a word. They didn't know what storm was coming. I didn't know how close Richard was to ruining everything, but Alexander knew one thing for certain. He would not let that man break them. Not this woman. Not this child. He stood in the glow of the chandeliers, his shadow stretching across the marble floor, and made his vow. Richard Blackwell's empire of cruelty would crumble, and it would happen in front of the very people he had tried to destroy. The night Richard chose for his plan was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of night where the building itself seemed to hold its breath. Maya arrived at her usual time, her hands tired but steady as she pushed the cleaning cart down the polished hallway. Lila walked beside her, notebook tucked under her arm, humming softly. To them, it was just another shift. But to Richard Blackwell, it was the night he would prove his twisted point. Earlier that day, he had strutted into the building with a small velvet case tucked under his coat. Inside was a $15,000 Rolex, purchased that very morning with a smirk of satisfaction. To him, it wasn't a watch. It was bait. He had already rehearsed the scene in his head. Maya's shock, the guards' stern faces, the humiliation of being caught with something she could never afford. He could already taste the satisfaction of watching her crumble. What Richard didn't know was that Alexander Grant had been watching him like a hawk. The new cameras Marcus installed were hidden in vents, in light fixtures, even in the baseboards of the walls. Every angle of Richard's setup was captured in crisp detail. The microphones picked up the smugness in his tone as he muttered to himself, "This will teach her where she belongs." At 7:45, Richard slipped into the supply closet where Maya kept her cart. He glanced over his shoulder, grinning, and placed the watch carefully beneath a stack of cleaning cloths. He patted the top as though he were crowning his masterpiece. "Perfect," he whispered. Absolutely perfect. Marcus, monitoring from a van outside with a bank of screens, leaned toward his mic. Target just planted the item, confirmed. We've got him from 5 different angles. Good, Alexander's voice replied through the earpiece. He was in his study, watching the live feed with his jaw set like stone. Now let's see how far he'll go. At 8:20, Richard made his move. He strolled down the hallway with 2 security guards trailing him. His voice was smooth, theatrical. Routine inspection, gentlemen, just making sure everything is in order. Maya looked up from polishing a brass railing, startled by the sudden intrusion. Mr. Blackwell, is something wrong? Richard smiled like a snake. Oh, nothing serious, just a quick check of supplies. We've had reports of missing items. Before she could respond, he was already at her cart, his hand diving beneath the rags with a flourish. When he pulled the Rolex into the air, he held it like a trophy. Ah, what do we have here? A $15,000 watch gone missing just yesterday from the executive offices. Care to explain how it ended up in your cart? Maya's face drained of color. Her hands shook as she stepped back, eyes wide. I've never seen that before. I don't understand. Richard's smirk widened. Of course you don't. It just happened to fall in there, right? Gentlemen, I think we need to call the police. One of the guards hesitated, phone in hand. Lila's chair scraped loudly as she stood up, her notebook falling to the floor. Mommy? She cried, her voice trembling. What's happening? Richard snapped at her cruelly. Be quiet, child. Your mother has serious explaining to do. Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she clung to her mother's arm. Maya, fighting back her own fear, held her close. It's all right, baby. I haven't done anything wrong. But her voice wavered. The guard lifted the phone, ready to dial. That was when another voice sliced through the air, calm, commanding, undeniable. Hang up that call. Every head turned. At the doorway stood Alexander Grant, tall, composed, his presence filling the room like thunder. Beside him, Marcus stepped in carrying a sleek black tablet. Behind them, 3 people Richard didn't recognize at first. 2 men and a woman, each with cameras and notepads in hand. Journalists. Richard froze, confusion flickering across his face before he forced a laugh. Alexander, thank God you're here. We caught her red-handed. Look, your watch, in her cart. Alexander's lips curved into something that wasn't a smile. It was colder. My watch? He raised his wrist. I've worn an Apple Watch for 5 years. I don't own a Rolex. Richard's smirk faltered. What are you saying? Marcus swiped across the tablet and the screen lit up with video footage. We're saying, he drawled, that we've got you on camera planting that watch yourself. He tapped again, switching angles. Angle 1, angle 2, angle 3. Want me to keep going? On the screen, Richard's own face stared back at him, caught red-handed slipping the watch into Maya's cart. The guard stiffened. The journalist leaned forward, recorders clicking on. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lila clutched her mother, whispering, Mommy, is the bad man going to stop now? Alexander knelt, meeting her frightened eyes with a gentleness she had never seen in him before. Yes, sweetheart, he said softly. The bad man won't scare you anymore. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue. The trap had been sprung, and there was no way out. Richard's smirk collapsed into something grotesque, half shock, half desperation, as the screen replayed his own betrayal in crystal-clear footage. The guards who had been ready to drag Maya away now exchanged uneasy glances, stepping back from her cart as though the watch itself was toxic. The journalists moved in, their cameras whirring, pens scratching, eyes hungry for the story unraveling before them. Alexander stepped further into the room, his voice low, steady, dangerous. Do you know what arrogance does, Richard? It blinds a man. It makes him think no one is watching, no one will dare to stop him. But the truth? He gestured toward the glowing tablet in Marcus's hands. The truth always leaves a trail, and tonight your trail ends here. Richard stammered, his face blotched red. You can't use this. This is entrapment. It's... Marcus cut him off with a smirk. Entrapment? You walked yourself straight into this. Bought the Rolex with your own card this morning, planted it in her cart, rehearsed your little performance. We've got the receipt too. You hung yourself. One of the journalists, a tall man with sharp glasses, leaned forward. Mr. Blackwell, he said, recorder in hand, care to comment on these allegations of racial targeting and evidence tampering? Richard's head whipped toward Alexander, panic spreading across his features. Alexander, listen. We can fix this. You don't understand. People like her. The words died the moment they left his mouth because Marcus swiped again, projecting screenshots onto a portable screen he had set up just outside the doorway. Richard's own private messages lit the wall like flames. Keep them in their place. They'll ruin the company if we let them get too comfortable. I'll fabricate something if I have to. She'll be gone before the month is over." Gasps filled the room. Maya's knees nearly buckled as she held Lila close, trembling with disbelief. Lila peeked out from behind her mother, confusion clouding her innocent face. "Mommy, why is he saying those things?" Maya smoothed her daughter's hair, whispering, "Because sometimes people's hearts are filled with darkness, but tonight, everyone can see it for what it is." Alexander turned back to Richard, his voice sharpened to a blade. "I gave you rope, Richard, and you didn't just hang yourself. You built the gallows with your own words." Richard lurched forward, sweat beading on his forehead. No, this isn't how it works. My father, he'll call the board. We'll crush this story. You think you can ruin me?" Another voice cut him off. Jennifer Walsh, the lead journalist, her camera trained squarely on his face. "It's already ruined, Mr. Blackwell. We're live streaming this. The board doesn't need to hear it tomorrow. The world is hearing it right now." Richard's body jerked as if the words were a physical blow. He spun toward the guards. "Stop them! Seize those cameras!" But the guards didn't move. Their loyalty shifted in an instant. What man would protect someone caught this red-handed, his voice dripping with hate in front of witnesses? They stepped back, crossing their arms, leaving Richard exposed. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps. 2 uniformed officers entered, led by Detective Harris, a man with a grim expression and no patience for nonsense. "Richard Blackwell," he said, his voice echoing against the marble walls. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted defamation, and racial harassment. Hands behind your back." Richard tried to laugh, but the sound cracked in his throat. "You can't. My family. My money, my—" The detective snapped the cuffs shut with a metallic finality. "Not anymore." Lila tugged gently at Alexander's sleeve, her voice soft, hopeful. "Mr. Grant, will the bad man go away now?" Alexander bent to her height, his eyes softening in a way few had ever seen. "Yes, little one. He's going away for a very long time, and he will never hurt your mother, or you, again." Maya's eyes filled, tears finally breaking free as she whispered, "Thank you, thank you." But Alexander didn't answer her right away. His gaze stayed locked on Richard, who was being led out in handcuffs, his protests echoing uselessly through the halls. For Alexander, this wasn't just victory, this was justice. And justice, after years of betrayal and cynicism, felt better than all the wealth in the world. The morning after Richard Blackwell was led away in handcuffs, the city awoke to headlines that burned his name into infamy. Every major news outlet carried the story. Vice President of Mitchell Enterprises arrested for racial harassment and conspiracy. His own words, vile, arrogant, undeniable, ran across television screens and filled social media feeds. Clips of the sting replayed on a loop. Richard smirking as he planted the watch. Richard caught in high definition trying to frame an innocent woman. Richard's face draining of color when confronted by Alexander and the press. By the time the board convened for an emergency meeting, the verdict was already written. Richard was finished. His family's shares, once protected by his father's influence, were stripped in a unanimous vote. Calls poured in from investors demanding distance, demanding answers. Within hours, Richard Blackwell, once untouchable, was nothing more than a liability with a name synonymous with disgrace. At home, Maya sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she watched the news segment play. Lila sat beside. Her, swinging her legs, too young to fully grasp the weight of what had happened, but old enough to sense its importance. When the reporter's voice declared that Maya Jefferson had been vindicated beyond doubt, Lila clapped her hands. "Mommy, they know the truth now. They know you didn't do anything bad." Maya smiled through tears, brushing her daughter's hair back from her face. "Yes, baby, they know, and no one can ever take that from us." At that same moment, Richard sat alone in a holding cell, his designer suit wrinkled, his face pale. He tried calling his father, but the line went unanswered. He tried calling old colleagues, but their numbers were blocked. The empire he thought would protect him had turned its back overnight. His wife filed for divorce that afternoon. His children, embarrassed and ashamed, refused to speak to him. The man who had mocked others for being invisible now found himself discarded, forgotten, abandoned. For Alexander, justice was not just a concept anymore. It was a living, breathing force. Standing in front of the boardroom window, he looked out over the city skyline, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not triumph, but clarity. Richard's fall was not just punishment, it was proof. Proof that arrogance, prejudice, and cruelty would always destroy themselves in the end. That evening, he invited Maya and Lila into his office. The room that once felt cold and guarded now carried a quiet warmth. Lila ran to the bookshelves, where her notebook and crayons still waited from the nights she had kept herself busy during her mother's shifts. Maya stood uncertainly in the doorway, still not sure how to face the man who had changed everything. Alexander motioned for her to sit. "Maya," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "I owe you an apology." Her brows furrowed. "An apology? For what?" "For testing you," he admitted, the words heavy but honest. "For doubting you, for believing that everyone has a price, until your daughter. Proved me wrong. That night in my study when she chose to tidy my money instead of touching it, she reminded me of something I thought I'd lost. She reminded me that honesty still exists." Maya's eyes glistened, her hand tightening around her daughter's. "Mr. Grant, we didn't do anything special. We just lived the way we were taught." Alexander shook his head. "No, Maya, you did more than that. You showed me that dignity doesn't depend on wealth, and that lesson was worth more than all the money in that safe." Lila skipped over, holding out a drawing she had made. A house, a sun, 3 figures holding hands. She beamed. "This is us. Mommy, me, and you, Mr. Grant." For a moment, Alexander's composure cracked. He looked at the child's smile, at Maya's quiet strength, and felt a sting of tears he hadn't let himself feel in decades. He cleared his throat, his voice steadying. "It's time things changed, not just for you, but for everyone like you. Starting tomorrow, Maya, you're not cleaning offices anymore. You're going to help lead this company. You'll make sure no one is ever treated the way Richard treated you. I want you as Director of Human Resources." Maya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Director? Mr. Grant, I don't—" "You do," Alexander interrupted firmly. "You more than anyone. You understand dignity, fairness, compassion. You understand what really matters. That makes you the most qualified person in this building." Lila squealed, hugging her mother tightly. "Mommy, you have an office now, like a boss." Maya's tears spilled freely as she whispered, "Thank you for believing in us." Alexander smiled faintly. "No, thank you for reminding me to believe in humanity again." As Richard sat in his cell, stripped of wealth, reputation, and power, Maya and Lila walked out of Alexander's office hand in hand, their heads high, their future no longer weighed down by fear, and Alexander, for the first time in years, felt the emptiness of his mansion begin to fade. Because now he knew, sometimes the greatest empires are not built from steel or money, but from simple, unshakable truth. 6 months later, the halls of Mitchell Enterprises felt different. What was once a place of silent pressure and sharp authority now carried an undercurrent of hope. Employees who used to keep their heads down when executives passed began to speak more freely. Laughter trickled into spaces where there had only been silence before. Change was no longer just a word spoken in board meetings. It had taken form, and at the center of it was a woman who had once pushed a cleaning cart through those same corridors. Maya Jefferson adjusted the cuff of her blazer as she walked toward the glass-walled conference room. The plaque on her office door read Director of Human Resources. Sometimes she still paused before entering, staring at the letters as though they belonged to someone else. But every day she stepped inside, shoulders back, knowing she had earned it, not because of charity, but because of truth, integrity, and resilience. Her first decision as director had been bold: the creation of a scholarship program for employees' children. She called it the Fair Chance Program. Within weeks, dozens of families applied. The program covered tuition, supplies, even mentorship opportunities. For many employees, it was the first time anyone in their family had dared to dream of higher education. And fittingly, the first recipient was her daughter. Lila thrived in her new private school. At 7, she spoke with the kind of clarity that startled adults, announcing at dinner one night that she would be a lawyer someday. "So I can help people like Mr. Grant helped us," she said proudly, her small hands waving animatedly as she explained her plan to stand in courtrooms and fight for justice. Alexander, sitting across the table in the home he had quietly opened to the felt something loosen in his chest every time he heard her voice. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. Its halls carried the sound of crayons scratching against paper, the patter of little feet, the occasional burst of giggles echoing off the marble. For a man who once believed his empire was all he had, Alexander now realized that the sound of a child's laughter was the most valuable currency of all. But change didn't come without resistance. Not everyone on the board approved of Maya's promotion. Whispers circled about Alexander's motives, about whether she deserved her position. Alexander silenced them not with anger, but with proof. Under Maya's guidance, employee turnover dropped. Productivity rose. Mitchell Enterprises began to receive national recognition for its commitment to diversity and inclusion. When a major business magazine ran a cover story calling the company the model for a just workplace, Alexander framed it and hung it in the lobby for every employee to see. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Maya knocked softly on Alexander's office door. "Mr. Grant," she said, stepping inside, "I thought you should see this." She placed a folder on his desk. Inside were handwritten thank you letters from employees' children who had benefited from the scholarship program, letters filled with dreams of becoming doctors, teachers, scientists. Alexander read them silently, his throat tightening. "This," he said finally, his voice thick, "this is worth more than any quarterly profit report." Maya smiled gently. This is what happens when power is used to lift, not crush. For a moment, Alexander couldn't speak. He simply looked at her, at the woman who had walked into his life with nothing but dignity, who had taught him through her daughter's innocence that humanity was not lost. That night, as he stood by the window of his study, Alexander thought about how far they had come. He remembered the safe, the stacks of bills left out like bait. He remembered holding his breath, waiting for proof that honesty was dead. And he remembered the sight of tiny hands stacking those bills into neat piles, not with greed, but with care. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself. That was the moment everything changed. Richard Blackwell, once his vice president, had already served 6 months of his sentence. Reports reached Alexander that Richard's wife had divorced him, his children had changed their last name, and his family's fortune had been swallowed by lawsuits. No one returned his calls. He was a man erased, remembered only for his downfall. But Alexander didn't dwell on Richard anymore. The man had destroyed himself. Alexander's focus was here, on the new life blooming around him, on the little girl who saw rain in his eyes and had unknowingly taught him to let the sun in again. And he knew, with certainty, that this was only the beginning. 3 years later, the mansion no longer echoed with silence. Its vast halls, once filled only with Alexander's solitary footsteps, now carried life. Lila's laughter spilled through the corridors, bouncing off marble walls, mixing with the warmth of Maya's voice as she balanced motherhood with her new role as a respected leader. What had once been a house of wealth had transformed into something far rarer, a home. On a bright spring afternoon, the conference hall of Mitchell Enterprises overflowed with employees, repo, earners, and community leaders. Banners hung across the stage read, "The Jasmine Jefferson Educational Fund, Building Futures, Honoring Honesty." Alexander stood at the podium, his suit immaculate as always, but his expression softer than the world had ever seen. At his side, Maya held Lila's hand, the little girl now 10 years old, her curls bouncing as she gazed out at the crowd with wide, unafraid eyes. Alexander cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the room. 3 years ago, I believed the world was empty of honesty. I believed everyone had a price. I lived behind walls of steel and marble, convinced that wealth was the only currency that mattered. And then, I met a 6-year-old girl. The crowd hushed, leaning forward. Alexander glanced down at Lila, who beamed up at him with innocent pride. I left a fortune in plain sight, testing her the way I had tested so many others, he continued, his tone heavy with emotion. And instead of reaching for it, she straightened the bills. She organized them carefully, saying they were messy, and she wanted to make them neat. She taught me in that simple act what no business deal ever had, that integrity is not about being watched, it is about who you are when no one is looking. Maya's eyes glistened, tears threatening to fall as she squeezed her daughter's hand. Lila leaned against her, whispering, "That's me, Mommy. He's talking about me." The audience sat spellbound, many wiping at their own eyes. Alexander let the silence breathe before continuing. Today, in honor of that lesson, I am proud to announce the creation of the Jasmine Jefferson Educational Fund. This fund will provide scholarships for thousands of children across the nation, children who deserve a chance to rise, not because of privilege, but because of their potential. This legacy belongs not to me, but to a little girl who reminded me what decency like about. Oaks like thunderous applause shook the hall. Lila hid her face shyly against her mother's side, but Alexander knelt down and whispered, "You deserve every bit of this, young lady." The reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing. "Mr. Grant," one called, "what inspired you to dedicate such a massive fund in her name? Why not in yours?" Alexander stood, his gaze steady, his words sharp with truth. "Because I acted asleep that night, but it was her honesty that woke me up. I am not the hero of this story, she is. and her mother, who raised her with values no amount of wealth could buy. The hall erupted in applause again, people rising to their feet. Maya's tears finally fell, her dignity now framed not by silence but by recognition. She had endured humiliation, fear, and hardship. But tonight, she stood tall before the world, honored for the strength that had carried her through. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Blackwell sat in the dim back office of a failing used car dealership, the sound of Alexander's speech flickering across an old television. His hair was gray now, his once proud frame slouched. He stared blankly at the screen as the world celebrated the people he had once tried to destroy. His phone lay silent on the desk. No calls, no friends, no family left to lean on. The man who once mocked others as invisible had himself become invisible, a cautionary tale studied in classrooms, his name synonymous with disgrace. Back in the conference hall, Alexander closed his speech with a single line that would be quoted for years. The honesty of a child can build a legacy greater than the wealth of a billionaire, and if we listen, if we choose to act, that honesty can change the world. The audience rose as one, applause thundering, flashes popping, but for Alexander, the only faces he truly saw were Maya's and Lila's. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Lila bounded into his study carrying a fresh drawing. This one showed a schoolhouse filled with smiling children under a bright sun. At the top, in messy handwriting, she had written, "For kids who need hope, like me once." Alexander's throat tightened as he took the drawing from her small hands. He placed it carefully on his desk, right beside the framed awards and corporate accolades. But to him, this piece of paper was worth more than all of them combined. He looked at Maya, who stood quietly in the doorway, her eyes soft, her pride radiant. For the first time in his life, Alexander Grant knew what legacy truly meant. It wasn't steel towers or endless wealth or his name etched in contracts. It was this, a child's laughter, a mother's strength, and the ripple of honesty that would carry into generations he would never meet. And as he sat back, watching Lila chatter about her dreams of becoming a lawyer, Alexander whispered the words he had once been too proud to admit. "I acted asleep, but she woke me up."